Well, Triumphant Light just came out, and there are more Pokemon with multiple cards. Let's take a look at the new ones and discuss which ones you should use in your deck. Just like last time, I'll be putting the newer cards on the right. We have a new Burmy. This Burmy does a bit more damage but has less HP, enough that a Charmander or Skarmory could theoretically one-shot you. I think the upside of damage and the downside of HP loss are relatively balanced, but the main consideration here is that Burmy can evolve into a Grass, Fighting, or Metal type. So if you're running Wormadam Trash or Wormadam Sandy Cloak, or if you're running a Mothim in any deck color, you definitely want the old Burmy. But if you're running Grass Wormadam or Mothim in a Grass deck, you could pick either one. I think Burmy is most effective in Metal decks, so probably most people would want the first card. Here's Combee. The old one has an interesting and reasonably strong draw effect, which helped you empty out your deck. The new one is a generic attacker. I think one of the main reasons of using the Combee line at all is for the draw effect, so I definitely run the first one, though the second one isn't a horrible card or anything. For Vespiquen, you have the same HP, retreat cost, and weakness. The old one does 70 damage for 2 energies, which is quite decent, while the new one does 120 damage for 3 energies, while taking 30 damage per use. I think it's not extremely easy to get 3 energies onto a Combee, but it's actually really high damage on that attack, worth it even despite the recoil. You could go either way here, and the left one is going to be more consistent, especially because it can attack twice in the time it takes for the new one to power up. But if you're building it on the bench, the right one is going to be better. In my opinion, both cards are teetering on the edge of being usable. This is one of the easiest calls in the set. I called the old Carnivine one of the worst cards in the game. The new Carnivine has a fantastic link effect with benched Arceus, which makes it one of the best early game attackers in the meta, letting you hit 50 damage with 1 energy as early as turn 2. The new one is better by a country mile. The two Heatrans are different types, and aren't competing for a deck slot at all, so it's not worth comparing them. For the record, I think the new Heatran card is very strong, and the old one is still usable. Here's our two Snovers. The first does 10 damage normally, but 40 if used against a fighting Pokemon. The second does 30, but needs an extra energy to do it. Originally, I thought the new one was almost always going to be superior, since it does more damage in 2 turns against any deck color other than fighting, plus you don't mind putting the extra energy on a Pokemon that's going to need it anyway. But I made an Abomasnow deck, and I realized the good allies are Manaphy for energy, then Palkia, Articuno, or obviously Arceus for the link effect. Since you're running a lot of EX basics, you're really weak to Sudowoodo, and the old Snover really punishes Sudowoodo. I don't know how common that card is going to be in the meta, but it's a big thing to consider in my opinion. Abomasnow is an interesting case. The old one was 120 for 4 energies, the new one is 80 for 3 energies, or 80 for 2 if you have Arceus on the field, and it has a bit less HP. Even without Arceus, I think the new one is going to be a bit better since the energy cost is more realistic to hit. Though notably, Water has great energy acceleration between Misty, Manaphy, and Island Vaporeon. Manaphy can also attach energies to Arceus, so the Arceus pairing is actually extremely strong here. I think the new Abomasnow card has a lot of potential, and is absolutely the better of the two. That being said, I think the vast majority of cards like Old Abomasnow are garbage, but the synergy Old Abomasnow has with Manaphy is strong enough to make it at least usable. We now have 3 Pikachus, and it's pretty interesting to see its body shape changing through the years. All 3 are about equally viable, I'd say. Basic heavy decks get the most use out of the middle one, though it's definitely inconsistent. The new one on the right is nice for setting up Cyrus to pull the opponent's bench Pokemon in. The original on the left is just stable and consistent. All 3 are about equally viable, I think, and it just depends on your deck construction. The 3 Raichus all have radically different roles in the deck, and all 3 work with Lieutenant Surge. The first one pairs with Apex Magneton and is good for closing out battles or clearing out high HP Pokemon, but it noticeably suffers a loss in tempo if it doesn't win the game on the spot with its attack. Island Raichu in the middle is just a strong, consistent attacker with some good HP for a lightning type. It can be slow to meet the energy requirement consistently, but Surge helps a lot there, and once it's ready to attack it can stack up damage and chip pretty quickly. The new Raichu is a bit cheaper, and has a decent attack that lets you mark some chip damage on the opponent's benched Pokemon, which is good for both Cyrus and for hitting kill thresholds with your late game attackers. Notably, its paired effect with Arceus makes it take minus 30 damage from all attacks, which makes it alarmingly tanky, especially in the early game, and combined with its relatively low attack cost, it's actually an early game fiend. Believe it or not, I actually think this new Raichu is the best of the 3, but they all have such different roles in the battle it's hard to compare them cleanly. Old Clefairy does 20 damage for 1 energy, new Clefairy does 30 for 2. I'd run the first one no question. Clefairy wants to evolve as soon as possible, and Old Clefairy gets 2 attacks off in the time it takes for new Clefairy to get 1. New Clefairy actually requires more energy than Old Clefable, so they additionally have very poor synergy. Mathematically, the old one is going to be better the vast majority of the time, I think. As for Clefable, it's an awkward situation. The old one works just like Apex Rapidash, but there's no equivalent Blaine card to power it up, so the power just feels a bit lacking. The new Clefable has a reasonably strong attack with a very nice card effect which reduces damage, but the energy cost is in this strange place where the attack feels too good to be 2 energies but not good enough to be 3. The damage reduction combined with your 100 HP does make you quite tanky, but the two obvious problems are first, the effect only works if you actually get your attack off, so you're not benefiting from that effect while setting up, and second, if you kill something, the incoming Pokemon doesn't have the damage reduction effect applied to it. Neither of these are bad cards per se, but neither is particularly good, I think. The whole Ghastly line got some new cards. Old Ghastly was a standard evolving basic. New Ghastly has this really funny effect where your opponent shuffles a random card back into their deck. This can be pretty disruptive if you get a lot of heads, since you can basically have your opponent drawing the same cards repeatedly. Either way, you really want to evolve your Ghastly as fast as possible, so you probably won't get too many chances to use it in a given battle. Both are fine. We've got 3 Haunters now. The new Haunter does 40 damage for 2 energies, which is not even that much more than our Apex Haunter doing 30. I think both previous Haunters are better since they aren't penalized for going first. The early evolution plus attack is quite valuable in my experience. You can take your pick of the first 2 Haunters, but I personally would never run this new one. New Gengar, however, is quite strong. The old Gengar had a rather disappointing 50 damage, with a card effect that, while powerful, was kind of too little too late by the time Gengar hits the field. New Gengar has more HP, less retreat cost, and the attack is really good too, with a guaranteed sleep effect. This card is actually extremely similar to Mismagius EX. The 2 energy cost is fantastic since it curves organically from the 1 energy Haunter. I think this Gengar is a very good card actually, and worth investigating for people who like Psychic decks. I definitely like it more than the old Gengar. The 2 Rotoms aren't super comparable. They both work in any deck, and they both have one specific role that they perform. Old Rotom does bonus damage to Pokemon with tools, while new Rotom hits the bench. Use which one you need. Somehow, we ended up with 3 Nosepass cards, including this brand new promo one where I couldn't find a high resolution picture of it. The first does 30 damage for 2 energy, the second does 10 damage for 1 energy, and the last can avoid all damage next turn on a coin flip. I'm gonna say this bluntly. None of these cards are good at all, and all of them only exist to get Probopass on the field. And Probopass cards are presently very energy hungry, so you really don't want these guys out until they're ready to receive energy from Dialga. The only reason you have a Nosepass out in the active slot is because you were forced to lead with it, and thus the best one is the one with the lowest retreat cost, which is the promo one. The Gible situation is quite interesting. If you're running the Dragon-type Garchomp, you definitely want the first Gible in case you only have water energy to put on it. But if you're running the Fighting Garchomp, you can actually go either way. The Dragon Gible isn't super effective to anything, but it notably has no weakness of its own, so unlike Fighting Gible, it won't die instantly to a Carnivine, and it'll only die half the time to Exeggutor. However, Fighting Gible is super effective to other Pokemon, and the Fighting type is quite good since you're super effective to many Dark types, most Electric types, and most Normal types. It's up to you which one you run, but the Dragon-type Gible should be a bit more consistent. Gabite is also an interesting question. Obviously, if you're running Garchomp EX, you'll use the Fighting-type Gabite. However, both work on Dragon-type Garchomp decks. Neither can attack if you only draw Water energy, but if you draw Fighting, the Fighting-type Gabite has 2 upsides. 1, you can attack for only 1 energy attachment, which is useful on a stage 1 Pokemon. 2 is you can still attack even if you only draw Fighting and no Water, so you're a bit more consistent. However, the Dragon-type Gabite has more HP and no weakness, while the damage is impressively higher. Both are viable, and it's your call which is more important to you. Old Croagunk has an attack that costs 2 energies and averages 40 damage with a full bench. New Croagunk is a standard evolving basic. Which of these is better will depend on how many basics you run in your deck, but obviously the new one is more consistent. Notably, this new Croagunk can still be called by Team Galactic Grunt. The 2 Toxicroak cards are radically different. The old Toxicroak is just a stronger version of the old Croagunk, with more HP and double the damage output, averaging 80 at a full bench. New Toxicroak just has a stronger version of Poison, which is doing 40 per turn if they don't switch out. If you're using a Poison deck with some Venoshock Pokemon, obviously you want to consider the new Toxicroak, but I think I prefer the older one most of the time to be honest. Our new Magnemite line is Metal type. If you're using it in an electric deck, you want the first one. If you're using it in a metal deck, you want the new one. Any other type and you want the center one. Very simple. I really don't care for the metal type Magneton though. Only 30 damage for 2 energies isn't very impressive. I'd much rather run Apex Magneton even on metal decks since it helps pay for Magnezone's attack cost and it's able to put energies on itself to offset its own high attack cost. I'd still run Apex Magneton on any deck type. And here's the new Magnezone. Even on a metal deck, it's very tempting to run Electric Magnezone for its power, since naturally you'll have the attached electric energies from your time as a Magneton. The new Magnezone does bring some nice features to the table though. First off, your attack only costs 2 energy attachments if you're running Apex Magneton and got a lightning energy or 2 from that. And unlike Electric Magnezone, you can use it infinitely, and not just until you run out of energies. Also, it has a nice paired effect with Arceus, which causes it to take 30 less damage from attacks, which pairs very nicely with its respectable 140 HP to give it quite a lot of staying power. Obviously, Old Magnezone is one of the best cards in the game, but New Magnezone does bring some rather attractive features for metal decks. Both are viable in metal, but of course, Old Magnezone is notable for working in any other deck type too. I wasn't really impressed by Old Mawile, which is really lacking in power for a card that doesn't evolve, and I'm not really impressed by New Mawile, which is also lacking in power. It does 20 damage normally, but 50 against metal types, and notably it can be used in any deck type. The obvious thing to do would be to use it in a deck where all the Pokemon are weak to metal, but what is that? Would be ice types or fairy types? Really hard to imagine a deck where it could justify its place. Bronzor. Both cards are pretty unimpressive to me. 30 damage for 2 or 10 damage for 1. I guess I'd run the old one for the power. Notably, the new one requires only colorless energies, as does the new Bronzong, so if you're gonna run it as an off-type, you definitely run the new one. Bronzong. The old one is one of those cards where the attack seems too good to have 2 energy costs, but not good enough to warrant 3. It's a very similar card to the Clefable we saw earlier, but the natural HP is better, while the damage reduction isn't quite as good. The new Bronzong works to punish high energy cards, and I think it's not a bad card exactly, but it's definitely not the win con you want to run in a metal deck. And if you're running it just for the insurance, it's a bit slow to set up, and not as strong as the energy cost suggests. I wouldn't run either of these Bronzongs personally, but I guess I like the new one more, even though the card art is a lot better on the old one. Ironically, I think the Psychic-type Giratina is probably a better card than the Dragon one, even in a Grass Psychic deck, which is really saying something. The old one is a card you could use for tanking and pivoting around, and you can even potentially attack with it in a pinch. The new one is the worst card in the whole game. We're up to 5 EVs now. The new one does 30 damage for 2 energies, while the previous ones were averaging 20 for 1. You really want to evolve Eevee straight away, so I'd never use this new one. Here's Snorlax. The old one has an extremely mediocre 70 damage for 4 energies. The new one has 100 damage with a detrimental self-sleep effect, but you actually get 2 Pokemon checkups before your next turn, so you have a 3/4 chance to wake up. Both of these cards work with the new Berry card, but obviously the 100 damage for 2 energies is a lot better than the 70 damage for 2. The new one is dramatically better in my opinion. Here's the Starly line. The old Starly has the very rare and valuable ability to destroy Pokemon tools, which is occasionally quite useful. I definitely run the old one, even though it's more vulnerable to being one-shot. For Staravia, it's the same situation as Haunter. The new one can attack on turn 3, which makes it very strong if you go first. Additionally, it has a better curve into Staraptor, which can attack with 1 energy thanks to Berry. I'd always run the new one. With the new promo Staraptor, we now have 3 of them. The old one had an attack which prevented retreating, which is quite powerful normally, especially when paired with Sabrina or Cyrus, but it's a bit slow for a stage 2 Pokemon. It's really more useful on Arbok or Houndoom, which can deploy faster. The middle Staraptor has a titanic 130 damage, which is really great for a non-EX Pokemon, and the downside of taking 20 damage is very manageable with its impressive 150 HP. I think this is a really good card actually, and you could absolutely build a deck around it. The promo one is a bit gimmicky, doing 90 damage while taking reduced damage from fighting type Pokemon specifically. I guess resisting fighting types is really nice if you're making a mono-colorless deck or something and you're stacking up fighting weaknesses. But really, I think I'd rather have the Clutch Staraptor than this, and I'd definitely rather have the Brave Bird one than either of the others. Finally, we have Shaymin. Both are utility cards for your bench. The old one gives passive healing to your whole team, while the new one reduces the retreat cost of all basics by 1. I think lowering retreat cost is more valuable than 10 health per turn, so I think the new Shaymin is much better, but I suppose it depends on what you need. Oh, there are a lot more than I thought for a mini expansion. Thanks for watching everyone. Feel free to bring up any considerations I might have missed in the comments.